He looked at her and decided she did not belong before she even said a word. The morning air carried a sharp chill across the marble entrance of the Federal Oversight Building, where polished glass doors reflected a city that never questioned who was allowed inside. Ava Johnson walked up the wide steps with calm, steady strides, her coat moving slightly in the wind, her expression unreadable. In her hand was a slim leather folder, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. But attention found her anyway. Officer Daniel Reeves stepped forward, his boots firm against the stone, his body blocking the entrance before she could reach the door. His eyes scanned her slowly, not with curiosity, but with judgment already decided. People moved around them, some slowing down, sensing tension, others pretending not to notice. Ava stopped just short of him, her gaze lifting to meet his, quiet but unshaken. He tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk forming as if the outcome of this moment had already been written in his mind. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. The city noise faded into the background as the space between them tightened. Daniel crossed his arms, his badge catching the morning light, a symbol he believed gave him the final word in every situation. "You cannot go in there," he said, his tone firm, edged with something colder than authority. Ava did not respond immediately. Instead, she glanced past him at the lobby beyond the glass, where security personnel stood near metal detectors, their movements routine, unaware of what was unfolding outside. Her silence seemed to irritate him. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it personal, but still loud enough for nearby ears. "This area is restricted," he added, though his eyes suggested the restriction had less to do with policy and more to do with her presence. A man in a business suit paused nearby, pretending to check his phone while clearly listening. A couple slowed their pace as they approached the stairs, their conversation fading as tension replaced it. Ava shifted her weight slightly, not backing away, not pushing forward. There was something deliberate in her stillness, something that did not match the situation he believed he controlled. Daniel noticed it, and it unsettled him, in a way he could not explain. He gestured toward the side of the building, dismissive. "You can try the public entrance around the corner," he said, already turning slightly as if the conversation was over. But Ava did not move. Her eyes stayed on him, steady, almost patient, as if she was waiting for something he could not see. For a brief second, the noise of the city returned, a distant siren, the hum of traffic, the faint echo of footsteps on concrete. And in that moment, without raising her voice, without showing anger, Ava Johnson made a choice to remain exactly where she was, standing at a door that was never meant to keep her out, even if the man in front of her believed otherwise. Daniel Reeves did not like the way she stood there. It was not defiance in the loud sense. It was something quieter, something that made his authority feel less certain than it should have been. He shifted his stance and stepped directly into her path again, making sure there was no space left between her and the glass doors behind him. "I told you already, this is a restricted entrance," he said, this time louder, letting his voice carry so the people nearby could hear. Ava Johnson remained still. Her eyes moved briefly, not toward him, but toward the reflection in the glass. Inside, one of the security guards adjusted his position, glancing out for a split second before looking away again. It was a small moment, almost invisible, but Ava noticed it. Daniel followed her gaze and frowned. He did not like that either. "Look," he continued, his tone tightening, "I do not know what you think you're doing here, but you are not getting in without proper clearance." His hand hovered near his radio, not pressing it yet, but ready. Ava finally spoke, her voice calm, measured, steady. "I'm exactly where I am supposed to be." The sentence landed softly, but it did not move him. If anything, it made his jaw tighten. "That is not your call to make," he replied quickly. "You need to step aside and use the public entrance." His words were procedural, but the edge in his tone told a different story. Behind them, the small crowd had grown. A woman paused halfway up the steps, watching with narrowed eyes. A man in a gray jacket slowed his pace, pretending to scroll through his phone while angling himself closer to hear. The tension had become something visible now, something people could feel even if they did not fully understand it. Ava shifted her folder slightly in her hand. The leather edge caught the morning light for a brief second. There was no badge displayed, no credentials offered, just quiet confidence that did not match the situation Daniel believed he controlled. He exhaled sharply and finally reached for his radio. "Dispatch," he said, keeping his eyes locked on Ava. "I have an individual attempting to access a restricted federal entrance without authorization." His words were precise, controlled, but there was a hint of something else underneath. Something closer to irritation than concern. Ava did not interrupt him. She did not argue. She did not explain. Instead, she slipped her phone out of her coat pocket with a smooth, unhurried motion. Her thumb moved across the screen once. Then she lowered it again. No announcement. No visible reaction. Just a quiet action that went unnoticed by most. Daniel finished his call and clipped the radio back to his shoulder. "You heard that," he said, nodding slightly as if reinforcing his position. "Someone is coming to escort you out." He expected resistance. He expected frustration, maybe even anger. But Ava only looked at him, her expression unchanged. For a brief second, something flickered in his mind. Doubt. It passed quickly, replaced by the certainty he had relied on for years. Authority had always worked for him. It always would. That was what he believed. The glass doors behind him opened slightly as someone exited the building. A man in a security uniform stepped out, pausing as he took in the scene. His eyes moved from Daniel to Ava, then back again. There was a hesitation there. Subtle, but real. Daniel caught it immediately. "Everything good, sir?" the guard asked carefully. Daniel answered before Ava could speak. "This is handled," he said, his tone sharp, dismissive. The guard nodded, but his eyes lingered on Ava for just a second longer than expected. Then he stepped aside, holding the door as another employee walked out. Ava watched this exchange without reacting. But inside that stillness, something was building. Not tension, not fear, something far more controlled. Daniel noticed the way the guard had looked at her, and it bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He straightened his shoulders, reinforcing his stance, reclaiming the moment. "You should have left when I gave you the chance," he said, his voice lower now, more personal. Ava met his gaze again. There was no anger in her eyes, no urgency, only patience. The kind of patience that did not belong to someone who was being turned away. And for the first time, without fully understanding why, Daniel Reeves felt like he might not be the one in control of what was about to happen next. The air around the entrance shifted in a way that could not be seen, but could be felt. Conversation slowed. Footsteps hesitated. Even the city noise seemed to pull back just enough to make space for what was unfolding on those marble steps. Ava Johnson stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her presence steady as if she had all the time in the world. Daniel Reeves, on the other hand, felt the need to fill the silence. It pressed on him in a way that made his authority feel less solid, less absolute than it had only moments before. He cleared his throat and adjusted his stance again, placing one hand firmly on his belt as if grounding himself in the role he believed defined him. "You are making this more difficult than it needs to be," he said, his voice controlled but edged with growing impatience. "All you have to do is step aside and follow instructions. That is how this works." Ava did not respond. Her eyes moved briefly past him again toward the lobby. Inside, movement had changed. One of the guards who had been standing near the metal detectors now spoke quietly into his own radio, his posture more alert than before. Another guard turned his head toward the entrance, his attention clearly drawn to something beyond routine. These were small details, easy to miss, but Ava noticed every one of them. Daniel noticed none of them. Instead, he focused on her silence, interpreting it as resistance rather than awareness. He took a small step closer, closing the remaining distance between them, lowering his voice as if attempting to assert control through proximity. "Let me make this clear," he said. "You do not have clearance to be here. If you continue to refuse to comply, you will be escorted off federal property." The words were procedural, but the tone carried something more personal. Around them, the small crowd had grown into a quiet audience. No one spoke openly, but their attention was undeniable now. A man near the base of the steps had stopped completely, his coffee forgotten in his hand. A woman standing near the railing watched with a look that was not curiosity anymore, but concern. Ava shifted her gaze back to Daniel. There was no fear in her expression, no urgency, only a calm that did not belong in a moment like this. And that calm began to create something else. Doubt, not in her, in him. It was small, barely there, but it existed. Daniel felt it and immediately pushed it aside. He had been in situations like this before. People challenged authority all the time. They hesitated. They resisted. But in the end, they always complied. That was the pattern he trusted. That was the pattern he expected. And yet, something about this felt different. Behind him, the glass doors opened again. This time, two security guards stepped out together. Their movements were not rushed, but they were not casual either. There was purpose in the way they positioned themselves just outside the entrance, their eyes scanning the scene with quiet focus. One of them, a tall man with a badge clipped to his chest, looked directly at Ava for a moment longer than expected. Then he turned to Daniel. "Everything all right out here, officer?" he asked, his tone neutral but measured. Daniel did not hesitate. "I have it under control," he replied quickly. "She does not have authorization and is refusing to leave." The guard nodded slowly, but his eyes returned to Ava again. There was recognition there now. Not clear, not confirmed, but present. Ava met his gaze for a brief second. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The guard inhaled slightly, as if about to speak, then stopped himself. Daniel caught that hesitation. It irritated him immediately. "There's no need to overcomplicate this," he said, his voice sharpening. "She needs to leave." The second guard shifted his weight, glancing between them. The energy had changed completely now. This was no longer a simple interaction at a building entrance. It had become something else, something that had not revealed itself yet, but was already reshaping the space around them. Ava remained still, her presence unwavering. And as the guards exchanged a quiet look, as the crowd leaned in just a little closer, as the silence stretched longer than it should have, one thing became clear without anyone saying it out loud. This moment was no longer under Daniel Reeves' control. Daniel Reeves felt the shift before he understood it. It was subtle at first, like a change in pressure before a storm, something in the air that made the moment stretch longer than it should have. The two security guards did not move to remove Ava Johnson. They did not step forward with force or authority. Instead, they stood still, their attention fixed on her in a way that did not match the situation Daniel believed he was controlling. He frowned, his patience thinning. "This is not complicated," he said, his voice firmer now, directed at the guards as much as at Ava. "She does not have clearance. She needs to leave." The taller guard inhaled slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. His eyes flicked once more to Ava, then back to Daniel. "Sir," he began, his tone respectful but cautious, "we might want to verify before taking further action." The suggestion landed like a challenge, even though it was not spoken that way. Daniel stiffened immediately. "Verify what?" he shot back. "I already told you what is going on." He gestured toward Ava without looking at her, as if she were a problem already solved. "She does not belong here." The words hung in the air longer than he expected, not because of their volume, but because of their weight. Ava heard them. So did everyone else. But she did not react. No flinch. No anger. No defense. Only silence. And that silence began to feel louder than anything Daniel had said. The second guard shifted slightly, his gaze narrowing as he studied Ava more closely. There was something in her posture, something in the way she stood without urgency, without explanation, that did not align with someone who had been caught in the wrong place. People who did not belong usually explained themselves. They argued. They tried to fix the situation. She did none of that. Instead, she simply waited. Daniel noticed the hesitation growing around him and felt it like a crack forming beneath his feet. He stepped forward again, closing the distance once. More, forcing the moment back into his control. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice, but sharpening every word, "I am giving you one last chance to walk away from this without it becoming a bigger issue. His eyes locked onto Ava, searching for a reaction, any sign that his authority still held weight. Ava finally moved, but not in the way he expected. She adjusted her grip on the leather folder, then lifted her chin slightly, meeting his gaze with calm certainty. There was no challenge in her expression, no threat, just quiet confidence that did not belong to someone being warned. And that was what unsettled him the most. Behind him, inside the building, movement increased. One of the interior guards spoke urgently into his radio now, his posture rigid, his attention fixed on the entrance. Another employee paused near the metal detectors, watching with growing curiosity. The rhythm of the building had changed. Daniel did not see it yet. He was too focused on the moment in front of him. "You are not listening," he said, frustration creeping into his tone. "This is federal property. There are rules." Ava spoke again, her voice even, controlled, and impossibly calm. "And you are about to learn which ones matter." The sentence was quiet, almost gentle, but it landed with a weight that made the guards glance at each other again. Daniel let out a short, disbelieving breath. He shook his head slightly, as if dismissing her words before they could take root. "That is not how this works," he replied. But even as he said it, something in the environment contradicted him. The taller guard reached for his own radio, hesitating for only a fraction of a second before pressing it. "Control, this is entrance team," he said, his voice steady but edged with something new. "We need confirmation on a possible executive arrival." The words changed everything, even before a response came. Daniel turned sharply toward him. "Executive arrival?" he repeated, confusion breaking through his certainty. "What are you talking about?" The guard did not answer immediately. His attention was on the radio, waiting. Ava remained exactly where she was, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged. But now, the space around her felt different. Not because she had done anything visible, but because the truth, whatever it was, had begun to surface. And for the first time since this began, Daniel Reeves was no longer the one defining what happened next. The radio crackled, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. The taller guard kept his hand pressed against the device, his eyes fixed ahead as if the response on the other end would decide more than just a simple confirmation. Daniel Reeves stood rigid, his attention now split between the guard and Ava Johnson, his earlier certainty beginning to fracture in ways he did not want to acknowledge. Then the voice came through, clear, sharp, and unmistakably authoritative. "Confirmed," the voice said. "Stand by and do not interfere." The words were not loud, but they carried weight. The kind of weight that did not need to be explained. The kind that shifted power without warning. The guard lowered his radio slowly, exchanging a quick look with his partner. Neither of them spoke right away, but their posture changed. Subtle, but undeniable. They were no longer waiting for Daniel. They were waiting for something else. Daniel frowned, stepping closer to them, his voice tightening with controlled frustration. "What does that mean, stand by?" he demanded. "I am handling this situation." The taller guard turned to him, his tone still respectful, but no longer uncertain. "Sir, we have been instructed not to interfere," he said. The phrasing was careful, but the message was clear. Daniel was no longer in control of the next move. That realization did not sit well with him. His jaw tightened, his shoulders squared, and he turned back to Ava as if reasserting his authority through sheer presence. "Whatever this is," he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate, "it does not change the fact that you cannot just walk into a restricted federal building." Ava did not move. She did not argue. She did not explain. Instead, she looked past him once more, toward the glass doors that now seemed less like a barrier and more like something waiting to open. The crowd behind them had grown quieter. Conversations had stopped entirely. Phones were no longer being checked discreetly. People were watching now, openly, sensing that something larger than a simple disagreement was unfolding. Daniel felt it, even if he refused to name it. He took another step forward, closing the distance again, trying to force the moment back into something he understood. "You should have shown identification from the beginning," he said, his tone shifting toward justification now, as if rewriting the situation in real time. "That is standard procedure." Ava tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged, her voice calm and steady when she finally responded. "You never asked for it," she said. The sentence was simple, direct, and it landed harder than anything else that had been said so far. For a split second, Daniel had no response. Not because he did not have authority, but because the truth in her words exposed something he could not immediately correct. He recovered quickly, his voice sharpening again. "I did not need to ask," he replied. "Your behavior was enough." The moment the words left his mouth, something shifted again. Not in Ava, in the guards. The second guard exhaled quietly, his gaze dropping for just a fraction of a second before returning to the scene. The taller guard remained still, but his expression hardened in a way that suggested he understood more than he was saying. Ava took a small step forward, not past Daniel, not pushing him aside, just enough to change the distance between them. It was a subtle movement, but it carried intention. Daniel reacted immediately, raising a hand slightly as if to stop her, but he did not touch her. Not this time. The hesitation was new. It came from somewhere deeper than procedure. It came from uncertainty. Ava looked directly at him, her voice still calm, still measured, but now carrying something else. "Finality. You made your decision the moment you saw me," she said, "and now you have to stand in it." The words settled into the space between them, heavier than before, heavier than anything that had come earlier. Daniel felt it, even if he tried to push it away. Behind him, the glass doors began to open again. This time, they did not stop halfway. This time, they opened fully, and the people inside were no longer just watching. The doors opened wide, and the shift in the atmosphere became undeniable. It was no longer just tension. It was recognition moving through the space like a quiet wave. 3 individuals stepped out from inside the building, their pace steady, their expressions focused. They were not rushed, but they carried a presence that made people instinctively move aside. The guards at the entrance straightened immediately, their posture changing in a way that Daniel Reeves could not ignore. Something official was unfolding, something structured, something that did not revolve around him. Daniel turned toward them, his mind searching for an explanation that would restore the order he believed he understood. One of the individuals, a middle-aged man in a dark suit with a security badge clipped neatly to his jacket, stepped forward slightly. His eyes moved past Daniel first, landing on Ava Johnson. There was no hesitation in his expression. No confusión. Only certainty. "Ma'am," he said, his voice respectful and direct, "we have been expecting you." The words landed with quiet force, cutting through everything that had come before. The crowd did not react immediately, but the silence deepened. Daniel felt it in his chest, a sudden drop that he could not explain. He turned sharply toward Ava, searching her face for something he had missed, something that would justify what he was hearing. But her expression had not changed. It had never changed. That was what made it worse. The man continued, stepping slightly to the side as if clearing a path. "Everything is ready inside," he added. Ava gave a small nod. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just acknowledgement. Then she took a step forward. This time, there was no one in her way. Daniel did not move immediately. His body hesitated, caught between instinct and realization. The moment stretched, and for the first time since this began, he did not know what to do. The taller guard stepped subtly to the side, creating space. The second guard followed. The path to the entrance was clear now, not because Daniel allowed it, but because the situation no longer belonged to him. Ava walked forward with calm, measured steps, passing Daniel without brushing against him, without even looking back. As she moved past, the air seemed to shift again, but this time it was not tension. It was resolution beginning to take shape. Daniel turned slowly, watching her as she approached the open doors. "Wait," he said, the word coming out before he could stop it. Ava paused just for a second, not because she had to, but because she chose to. She turned her head slightly, enough to acknowledge his voice without fully facing him. Daniel took a step forward, his earlier authority now replaced by something far less stable. "You did not identify yourself," he said, his voice searching for ground to stand on. It sounded different now, less certain, less controlled. Ava looked at him then, fully this time. Her gaze was steady, but there was something else in it now. Not anger, not satisfaction, clarity. "You never gave me the chance," she said. The sentence was quiet, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened. Daniel opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out. Around them, the people who had been watching were no longer pretending not to see. The moment had become something undeniable, something that would be remembered. Ava turned back toward the entrance and continued walking. The man in the suit stepped aside respectfully, allowing her to pass first. As she crossed the threshold into the building, the guards inside straightened, their attention fixed on her with unmistakable recognition. Behind her, the doors remained open for just a moment longer. Long enough for Daniel Reeves to stand there, no longer blocking anything, no longer controlling anything, and finally beginning to understand that the moment he thought he owned had never belonged to him at all. Inside the building, the temperature felt different, cooler, controlled, precise, like every inch of the space had been designed to maintain order. Ava Johnson walked forward without hesitation, her steps echoing softly against the polished floor. Behind her, the glass doors slowly closed, sealing off the noise of the city and leaving the tension outside. But the moment did not end there. It followed her inside. The guards near the metal detectors straightened as she approached, their posture shifting from routine alertness to formal recognition. One of them gave a subtle nod, not exaggerated, not performative, but unmistakably respectful. Ava acknowledged it with the slightest movement of her head, then continued forward. The man in the dark suit walked just behind her, not leading, not directing, but accompanying, as if the building itself had adjusted to her presence. On the other side of the glass, Daniel Reeves remained frozen for a moment longer than he expected. The scene replayed in his mind, each detail refusing to align with the version of reality he had been operating under. He had seen situations escalate before. He had handled confrontations, resistance, challenges to authority. But this was different. This had not escalated. It had reversed. He exhaled slowly, then stepped forward, pushing the glass door open and walking inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the atmosphere changed again. Not because of him, but because of where he now stood in relation to everything else. The guards who had once taken their cues from him no longer looked in his direction. Their attention remained fixed ahead toward Ava. Daniel adjusted his posture instinctively, tried to reclaim some sense of control. He moved with purpose, closing the distance between himself and the group ahead. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice firm, attempting to re-establish authority through tone alone. Ava stopped walking, not abruptly, not defensively, just enough to acknowledge that he had spoken. The man in the suit slowed as well, turning slightly but not stepping in front of her. Daniel approached, his steps quicker now, driven by a need to understand what had just happened. "I need clarification," he said, directing his words toward the man in the suit rather than Ava. "What exactly is going on here?" The man looked at him calmly, his expression composed, as if this moment had already been anticipated. "Officer Reeves," he said, using Daniel's full name without hesitation. "Everything is proceeding according to schedule." The use of his name caught Daniel off guard. He did not show it, but it registered. "How do you know my name?" he asked, his tone tightening again. The man did not answer that question directly. Instead, his attention shifted back to Ava, as if the conversation had already moved past Daniel without his consent. Ava turned slightly, just enough to face Daniel once more. Her expression remained calm, but there was something different now. Not distance, not superiority, just clarity that had been waiting beneath the surface from the very beginning. "You wanted identification," she said, her voice steady, measured, and impossible to misinterpret. Daniel nodded once, almost automatically, still trying to piece together the shifting reality around him. "Yes," he replied, "that is standard procedure." Ava held his gaze for a moment, then slowly opened the leather folder she had been carrying the entire time. The motion was deliberate, unhurried, controlled. Inside, neatly placed, was an official credential. She did not hand it to him. She did not step closer. She simply angled it just enough for him to see. The seal was unmistakable. The title even more so. Director of Federal Oversight. For a brief second, the world around Daniel seemed to narrow. The sounds of the building faded. The presence of the guards, the man in the suit, the people watching from a distance, all of it blurred into the background. His focus locked onto the credential, onto the reality he had failed to recognize. Ava closed the folder gently, returning it to her side. "You were right about one thing," she said quietly. "There are rules." And now, finally, Daniel Reeves understood that he had never been the one enforcing them. The weight of the truth did not explode. It settled. Quiet. Heavy. Unavoidable. Daniel Reeves stood there, his eyes still fixed on the place where the credential had been, as if his mind was struggling to catch up to what his eyes had already confirmed. Director of Federal Oversight. The words echoed in his head, not loud, but persistent, refusing to fade. Around him, the building continued to move, but the rhythm had changed. Conversations were quieter. Movements were more deliberate. People were no longer just passing through. They were observing. Ava Johnson did not rush him. She did not repeat herself. She did not demand anything. Instead, she turned slightly, signaling to the man in the suit that she was ready to continue. He nodded immediately, stepping forward with renewed purpose. "This way, Director Johnson," he said, his voice steady, respectful, aligned with a structure that Daniel had not even realized was already in motion. Ava began walking again, her pace unchanged, her posture the same as it had been from the moment she arrived. Nothing about her had shifted, and that was what made everything else feel so unstable. Daniel blinked once, then twice, forcing himself back into the present. "Wait," he said again, but this time the word did not carry authority. It carried uncertainty. Ava stopped, not because she had to, but because she chose to acknowledge him one last time. She turned her head just enough to meet his gaze. Daniel took a step closer, his voice lower now, almost searching. "Why were you not identified in the system?" he asked. It was not an accusation. Not anymore. It was confusion trying to find order. Ava studied him for a brief moment, then answered with the same calm precision she had maintained from the beginning. "Because this visit was not about being announced," she said. "It was about being observed." The sentence settled into the space between them, and this time, Daniel did not try to push it away. He felt it, understood it, even if only partially. His mind began to retrace every moment outside, every word he had said, every assumption he had made. And for the first time, those moments did not feel justified. They felt exposed. Behind Ava, two more individuals stepped forward from a nearby corridor, their presence formal, their attention focused. One carried a tablet, the other a slim folder similar to Ava's own. They stopped at a respectful distance, waiting. The structure of the building had aligned itself fully now, not around Daniel, but around her. Ava shifted her gaze briefly toward them, then back to Daniel. "You are doing your job," she said. The words were not harsh, but they were not comforting either. There's a difference between enforcing rules and deciding who they apply to. Daniel swallowed, the weight of that distinction pressing into him more than any accusation could have. He glanced around, noticing for the first time how every movement in the space connected to something larger, something he had not been aware of before. The guards were no longer just guards. The staff were not just employees. The building itself was not just a location. It was a system, and he had just revealed how he operated within it. Ava took a step back, creating space not for herself, but for the moment to settle. "This is where I step in," she said quietly, not to correct a mistake, but to understand it. The man in the suit nodded slightly, then gestured forward once more. Ava turned and continued walking, this time without pause, without interruption. The individuals behind her fell into place, moving with her, not ahead, not above, but in alignment. Daniel remained where he was, no longer trying to stop her, no longer trying to lead the situation. For the first time since this began, he was not acting. He was watching. And as Ava Johnson disappeared further into the building, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was never about the door. It was about everything that happened before she reached it. The hallway ahead stretched long and quiet, lined with glass offices and closed doors that reflected the movement of those passing through. Ava Johnson walked at the center of it all, her presence no longer questioned, no longer interrupted, but it was not loud authority that followed her. It was something quieter, something more precise. Behind her, the team moved in sync, their steps measured, their attention sharp. The building had shifted into a different mode, one that did not announce itself, but made itself known through subtle changes in posture, in tone, in silence. Daniel Reeves stood where he had been left, but the stillness did not hold him for long. Instinct pushed him forward. Not the same instinct that had driven him outside. This one was different, less certain, more urgent. He began walking down the hallway, his pace controlled at first, then slightly faster as the distance between him and Ava grew. He was not trying to stop her anymore. Not directly, but he needed to understand what he had stepped into. As he moved, he became aware of the way people looked at him now. It was not the same as before. The subtle nods, the quiet acknowledgments of authority, they were gone. In their place was something harder to define. Awareness. Observation. As if he had become part of something being evaluated rather than something giving orders. Ahead, Ava slowed as she approached a set of double doors at the end of the corridor. The man in the suit stepped forward and opened one of them, holding it with quiet respect. She entered without hesitation. The team followed. The door remained open just long enough for Daniel to reach it. He paused at the threshold, looking inside. The room was large, organized, deliberate. A long table stood at the center, surrounded by individuals already seated, their attention turning toward the entrance the moment Ava stepped in. There were no raised voices, no dramatic reactions, just a collective shift in focus that made it clear who the room was waiting for. Ava walked to the head of the table and placed her folder down with a soft, controlled motion. She did not sit immediately. Instead, she looked around the room, her gaze steady, taking in every face, every detail, as if confirming something that had already been set in motion long before she arrived. Daniel remained at the doorway, uncertain now in a way he had never experienced in his role. One of the individuals seated at the table glanced toward him briefly, then back to Ava, as if silently, acknowledging his presence without inviting it. Ava noticed him. Of course she did. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. There was no hostility there, no anger, only the same clarity she had carried from the beginning. "You can come in," she said. The invitation was simple, but it was not permission in the way he was used to. It was something else, a shift. Daniel stepped inside slowly, the weight of the room settling over him with each step. The door closed behind him with a soft sound that felt louder than it should have. He moved to the side of the room, not taking a seat, not stepping forward, unsure of where he belonged in a space that clearly operated beyond his understanding. Ava finally took her seat at the head of the table. The movement was calm, deliberate, final. The man in the suit remained standing beside her, while the others around the table straightened slightly, their attention fully aligned. Ava opened the folder once more, revealing documents neatly arranged, each page placed with purpose. She did not rush. She did not look at Daniel again. Instead, she addressed the room. "We're going to begin with the entry point," she said, her voice steady, carrying through the space without needing to rise. Not the building, the system. The words settled into the room, and for a moment, no one moved. No one spoke, because everyone there understood that what was about to happen was not a discussion. It was an examination, and Daniel Reeves, standing at the edge of the room, realized with growing clarity that he was no longer part of the authority. He was part of the case. The room did not react with surprise. It reacted with readiness. Ava Johnson sat at the head of the table, her presence anchoring the space in a way that made everything else align around her. The individuals seated across from her did not question her authority. They adjusted to it. Folders opened. Tablets lit up. Pens hovered above paper, waiting. Daniel Reeves remained standing near the sidewall, his position no longer defined by command, but by observation. For the first time in his career, he was not directing the situation. He was inside it, Ava placed her hand lightly on the documents in front of her, then looked up, her eyes moving across the room with calm precision. "We begin with a simple question," she said. "What happened at the entrance?" The words were measured, but they carried weight that pressed into every corner of the room. No one rushed to answer, not because they did not know, but because they understood the nature of the question. This was not about recounting events. It was about revealing them. The man in the dark suit stepped slightly forward. "Director Johnson," he said, "we have already secured external footage and internal surveillance." Ava gave a small nod. "Then let us not rely on memory alone," she replied. The man tapped his tablet, and within seconds, a screen on the far wall illuminated. The image appeared clearly. The entrance, the steps, the moment Daniel had stepped in front of her. The room grew still, not silent, focused. The footage played without sound at first. Ava watched it without shifting, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. The others watched with equal attention. Daniel felt the pull of it immediately. He turned toward the screen despite himself. There he was, clear, unmistakable. The stance, the gesture, the way he had positioned himself to block her path. From his angle, it looked different. Not like procedure, like judgment. The footage continued. Ava arriving, stopping, the exchange. Even without sound, the tension was visible. The distance, the posture, the decision made before words were even spoken. Ava lifted her hand slightly, and the footage paused. "Freeze it there," she said. The image stopped on the exact moment Daniel had gestured toward the side entrance, his body angled, dismissive. Ava leaned forward just slightly, her voice calm but precise. "This moment," she said, "this is where the decision was made. Not at the end, not during escalation. Here." The room remained still, absorbing the weight of that statement. One of the individuals seated at the table adjusted his glasses, his eyes narrowing as he studied the screen. No one argued. No one interrupted. Ava turned her gaze from the screen to Daniel. Not sharply, not accusing, direct. "Officer Reeves," she said, her voice steady, "walk us through your reasoning at this exact moment." The room shifted again, not physically, but in focus. All attention moved to him. Daniel felt it immediately. Every eye, every expectation. He straightened slightly, instinct trying to return, try to reclaim structure where there was none. "I was enforcing access control," he said, his voice controlled, though not as steady as before. "The entrance is restricted." Ava listened without interruption. Then she asked the question that cut deeper than the first. "What indicated to you that she did not have clearance?" The room held still again. Daniel opened his mouth, then paused. The answer should have been simple. Routine. Procedural. But now, standing inside this room, with the footage frozen behind him, it did not feel that way. "I assessed the situation," he replied. Ava did not move, did not react. She only asked the next question. Based on what? The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. Daniel glanced briefly at the screen, at the version of himself captured in that single frame. Then back at Ava. His mind searched for justification, for language that would restore balance. But the more he searched, the more something else surfaced. Not certainty. Exposure. Ava leaned back slightly in her chair, her voice calm, but carrying a clarity that left no room for avoidance. "This is not about what you did," she said. "It is about why you decided to do it before you had the information to justify it." The words settled over him, over the room, over the moment itself. And for the first time since this began, Daniel Reeves realized that the most important part of what happened was not the action. It was the assumption that came before it. The silence did not break immediately after Ava Johnson's words settled into the room. It deepened. It pressed inward, forcing every person present to sit with what had just been revealed. Daniel Reeves stood still, his posture no longer defensive, no longer authoritative, but something far more exposed. His eyes drifted back to the frozen image on the screen, that single frame where his decision had already been made before any fact had been confirmed. He inhaled slowly, as if trying to regain control over something that had already slipped beyond his reach. I made a judgment based on the situation, he said finally, his voice lower now, less certain than before. Ava did not interrupt him. She allowed the words to exist, to stand on their own. Then she leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady, her tone unchanged. You made a judgment based on appearance, she said. The correction was not loud, but it was exact. Daniel felt it land. He did not respond immediately, because this time there was no space to deflect, no structure to hide behind. Around the table, the others remained silent, but their attention sharpened. One of them made a note. Another adjusted the angle of the screen, zooming slightly closer on the paused image. The moment was being examined from every angle, not to accuse, but to understand. Ava continued, her voice calm, but now carrying a deeper layer of precision. You did not ask for identification. You did not verify clearance. You did not confirm intent. You decided. The repetition built weight, each sentence stacking on the last, forming something that Daniel could no longer step around. He swallowed, his throat tightening as the reality of the sequence became undeniable. I was following protocol, he said, but even as the words left his mouth, they sounded weaker than before. Ava tilted her head slightly, studying him, not with anger, but with clarity that cut deeper than confrontation ever could. Protocol begins with inquiry, she replied, not assumption. The distinction hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Daniel glanced down briefly, then back up, his mind searching for something that would restore balance. But every path led back to the same point. The moment on the screen, the decision before the facts. Ava gestured lightly toward the display. Run it again, she said. The footage resumed, this time with sound. Daniel's voice filled the room, firm, dismissive, certain. You cannot go in there. The words echoed in the controlled space, louder now, stripped of the context he had once relied on. They sounded different here, colder, final. Ava watched without reacting, her expression unchanged. But the room absorbed it differently now. The tone, the timing, the absence of any attempt to verify. When the clip ended, Ava spoke again, her voice steady, but carrying a quiet finality. Authority without awareness becomes something else, she said, and that something else is what we are here to examine. Daniel felt the words settle deeper than anything before them. Not because they were louder, but because they were true in a way he could no longer deny. He looked around the room, noticing for the first time that no one was looking at him with hostility. They were looking at him with focus, with expectation, as if waiting to see whether he understood what had been placed in front of him. Ava held his gaze, giving him the space to respond, not to defend himself, but to recognize the moment for what it was. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders shifting, not disappearing, but changing. I should have asked, he said quietly. The admission was small, but it carried more weight than anything he had said before. Ava nodded once, not in approval, but in acknowledgement. That is where it begins, she said. Not with punishment, with recognition. The room remained still, but the energy had shifted again. This was no longer just about what had happened at the entrance. It was about what that moment revealed. And as Daniel Reeves stood there, no longer resisting, no longer asserting, but finally beginning to see, it became clear that the real consequence was not what he might lose. It was what he had just learned about the way he had been using the power he thought he understood. The room did not erupt into action after Daniel Reeves spoke. It did not need to. The shift had already happened. It was quiet, controlled, and far more powerful than any raised voice or sudden consequence. Ava Johnson sat back slightly in her chair, her hands resting calmly on the table, her gaze steady as she observed the change in him. Recognition had begun, and in this room, that mattered more than anything else. One of the individuals seated at the table leaned forward, sliding a document across toward Ava. She glanced at it briefly, then turned it slightly so that it faced Daniel. This is not an isolated moment, she said. Her voice remained calm, but now there was a deeper layer beneath it. Something structured, something prepared. Daniel stepped closer, his eyes moving down to the page. It was a report. Dates, times, notations. Each entry brief, precise, and aligned in a way that told a larger story without needing explanation. Incidents at traffic stops, field interactions, complaints that had not escalated but had been recorded. Patterns. The word was not written, but it was there in the arrangement of the details. Daniel felt his chest tighten slightly as he read. These were not accusations thrown together in response to a single event. They were observations collected over time. Quietly, carefully, Ava watched him take it in, not rushing him, not interrupting the process. This is why I was not announced, she continued. Because systems do not reveal themselves when they know they are being watched. They reveal themselves when they believe they are operating normally. The words settled into him in a way that made the earlier moment at the entrance feel even heavier. That moment had not been random. It had been part of something larger. Something he had not seen because he had never been looking for it. I did not know this was happening, he said, his voice lower now, not defensive, but searching. Ava nodded slightly. That is the point, she replied. Most do not. Not because they are incapable, but because they're not trained to question what feels routine. Around the table, the others remained still, but their attention stayed locked on the exchange. This was not about catching someone in a mistake. It was about revealing a pattern that had gone unnoticed by the person living inside it. Ava gestured lightly toward the document. These are not conclusions, she said. They are indicators. Moments where decisions were made before verification. Moments where authority moved faster than awareness. Daniel looked back down at the page, his mind connecting each entry to a memory he had not considered significant at the time. Small choices, quick decisions, each one justified in the moment. But together, they formed something he could no longer ignore. Ava leaned forward slightly, her voice steady, grounded. Accountability is not about a single action, she said. It is about understanding the pattern that leads to it. The room held that sentence in silence. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of it settling deeper than anything that had come before. He was not being shouted down. He was not being cornered. He was being shown something, and that made it harder to resist. What happens now? He asked quietly. The question was no longer about control. It was about consequence. Ava met his gaze, her expression unchanged, but her tone carried quiet finality. Now we address it, she said, not with reaction, with correction. The man in the suit stepped forward again, placing another document on the table. A formal process. Review. Training. Evaluation. Structured steps designed not to punish, but to change. Ava did not look at the document this time. She looked at Daniel. Because the outcome depends on what you do with what you now understand, she said. The sentence was simple, but it carried the full weight of everything that had unfolded. Daniel stood there, no longer resisting, no longer searching for justification, but facing the reality of what had been revealed. Not just the moment at the door, but everything behind it. And as the room remained still, as the system around him prepared to move forward, one truth became clear in a way it never had before. This was not the end of what happened at the entrance. It was the beginning of what would change because of it. The room remained still for a moment longer after Ava Johnson spoke, as if allowing the weight of everything to settle into place before moving forward. Then, slowly, the structure resumed. Not abruptly, not forcefully, but with intention. The man in the suit gathered the documents on the table and organized them into a clean stack, sliding them toward Daniel Reeves with quiet precision. This is the formal review process, he said, his voice calm and steady. It begins today. Daniel looked down at the papers, then back up at Ava. The earlier tension that had defined him at the entrance was gone. In its place was something quieter, something more grounded. Not defeat, not shame, but awareness. The kind that does not arrive all at once, but stays once it does. Ava stood from her chair, her movement deliberate but unhurried. The others in the room followed, not out of obligation, but alignment. The meeting was not ending because something had been decided. It was ending because something had been understood. She stepped around the table, closing the distance between herself and Daniel. not as an authority approaching a subordinate, but as someone completing a process that had already reached its conclusion. "This is where most people expect punishment," she said. "But that is not what changes systems." She paused, just briefly, allowing the idea to settle. "What changes systems is what happens after this room." Daniel held her gaze, listening in a way he had not at the beginning of the day. Ava continued, her voice calm, steady, and final. "You will go through review. You will go through training. And you will return to the same kind of situations you faced this morning. The difference is that next time, you will not decide before you understand." The sentence did not feel like a warning. It felt like a line being drawn between who he had been and who he would choose to become. Daniel nodded once, slowly. "I understand," he said. And this time, the words were not a response. They were a commitment. Ava studied him for a brief moment, as if measuring the weight of that acknowledgement. Then she gave a small nod of her own. "That is where this ends," she said quietly. "Not with what you did, but with what you do next." She turned then, stepping away from him, signaling the close of the process without needing to announce it. The room began to shift again, not back to what it had been before, but forward into what came after. Files were collected, devices powered down, conversations resumed, but softer now, more focused. Daniel remained standing for a moment longer, holding the documents in his hands, feeling the reality of them in a way that no order or command had ever made him feel before. Then he turned and walked toward the door. As he stepped back into the hallway, the building felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. He moved past the glass walls, past the same guards, the same corridors, the same structure that had always been there. But now he saw it differently, not as a place where authority was assumed, but as a system where every decision carried weight beyond the moment it was made. Outside, the sunlight had shifted slightly, casting longer shadows across the marble steps. Daniel stepped through the glass doors and paused at the top of the entrance. The same place where it had started. The same place where he had made a decision without asking a single question. He looked down at the steps, then out at the street beyond, the city moving as it always had, unaware of what had just changed inside one of its buildings. For a moment, he stood there in silence. Then he adjusted his posture, not to assert control, but to carry something different. Awareness. He turned and walked down the steps, not as the man who had blocked the door, but as someone who finally understood what it meant to stand in front of one. And somewhere behind him, beyond the glass, and the quiet halls, Ava Johnson continued her work, unseen, unannounced, ensuring that the next time power stood at a door, it would know exactly what it was meant to protect. He thought he was the gatekeeper, but that day, he learned he was the lesson.